Greetings, audiophiles and Legend of Korra fans. Oh, who am I kidding? Welcome, Bolin fans, to my reading of my fanfiction, Castle of Glass. Legend of Korra and the characters therein belong to their respective owners and creators. The original characters and the premise of this story belong to me. Enjoy! Part 8. Convergent Heart. Kida felt raw, used up. She had managed a quick nap before someone had shaken her awake and informed her that Bolin and the others had likely failed in their mission to rescue the captured Chief Tonrock. Now she sat like a dead thing, staring at one of the steel fox pelts on the wall. Her mind was washing over and over like waves on a cold shore, but her body was motionless. Lily walked by, carrying an armload of fresh bandages. She kicked Kida's legs out of the way. "What is wrong with you, lazy girl?" she growled, setting her load down in a waiting basket. She placed hands on her hips and glared. Kida was only half awakened from her reverie by the other girl's kick. Is this about that boy? I saw you making moony eyes at that earthbender friend of the Avatar. You know he's probably fine, right? Avatar Korra is with him." "You're probably right," Kida mumbled, trying to unjumble her thoughts. Why was she so worried? Certainly she liked Bolin. She had kissed him after all. He was a good friend, if nothing else. Her mind wouldn't stop showing her Norok's mangled body, but with Bolin's face, his bright eyes gone gray with death. The thought made her tumble farther away from reality. Lily snapped her fingers in front of Kida's face, plopping down on the bench beside her. "Earth to annoying girl, stop wallowing. You are not helping that boy by moping around when you don't even know if he's hurt or not." "Bolin." "Huh?" "His name is Bolin." Kida's eyes focused again, taking in the healing hut, still full to bursting with wounded, though the new had finally stopped coming in. "Bolin, right, whatever. He's probably just fine and you're acting like he's already dead. Trust me, you may have special healing powers, but you're not magic. You can't just sense when someone you like is dead. Now stop moping and make yourself useful to the people right here." Lily gestured to the men on the cots, filling the room so that the healers barely had paths to walk around them. Kida raised her eyes, and across the room she saw her father. He was seated against the wall on a bench just like hers. He was avoiding her eyes. She clenched her hands into fists, grabbing up a handful of her tunic. She glanced towards Lily, who was giving her a no-nonsense glare. "Fine," Kida exhaled. She rose stiffly, as if she had aged several decades in the time she had been sitting there. "Good. We don't need any dead weight around here." Lily nudged Kida in what she was sure was supposed to be a playful gesture, even as Kida flinched at Lily's choice of words. Kida wove her way across the room to her father. He couldn't help but look at her as she stopped before him, planting her own hands on her hips, adopting Lily's pose. "You are not seriously injured, you know. You can go home." "Some of my men are here," her father said. Kida blinked. It hadn't occurred to her that he might be in charge of people. She glanced at the nearby patients. "They're resting," she said, feeling annoyed for some reason. "You can go." "My daughter is here," he said, and this time she looked away. Her boots were suddenly fascinating. "Kida." He hunched his shoulders and tilted his head so he was in her view again. "What is it? What's making you so upset? Is it the Avatar?" "They said she must have failed her mission. Their plane was shot down," Kida sighed, hugging herself. Her father reached up and forced her arms away from her body, pulling her down to sit beside him. Suddenly she was overcome by his father's smell. How strong and protective he seemed. She hadn't felt this way about him since her mother had died. He had been a mountain of strength in those days. How had she forgotten that? She let her head rest against his shoulder, feeling his long hair, the same dark color as her own, tickle her face. He reached across himself and pulled one of her hands into his lap to hold it. I know you're worried about that boy, Bolin. You remembered his name? Of course. I only pretend to forget these things. I'm old, but not that old. You don't like him. Her words were a statement of fact. I hate any boy who looks at my daughter the way he looks at you, Torque chuckled. What do you mean? Kita sat up slightly, looking at the profile of her father's face. Sharp Roman nose, assertive brow, well-defined jaw. He was handsome, she guessed, even if there was some gray in his beard. You know what I mean. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. You know exactly. And I assure you that I don't approve, but I seriously doubt that will stop you. My disapproval has never stopped you from doing anything. It usually encourages me, Kita admitted, smiling herself and snuggling against her parent again. I'd say I was sorry, but that would be a lie. This made him snort with laughter and put his arm around her for an awkward one-armed squeeze. Kita, I don't tell you enough that... The door to the healing hut flew open again, and two figures were framed black against the world of white behind them. Kita sprang up, healer's instincts kicking into high gear. She squinted as the two newcomers entered, one clearly supporting the other. Asami? Kita gasped as she recognized the closer of the two first. Then Kita's eyes opened even wider. Chief Tonrak! She spoke too loudly, but anyone who had not been paying attention was now peering towards the door. The young woman was supporting the obviously wounded Tonrak into the hut. Healers rushed to take their leader and guide him to one of the few remaining cots. Kita pushed forward with the rest, but quickly realized that now there were too many of them all focused on one patient. Lily shoved Kita back and then gave her a nod, which Kita didn't understand in that moment. She turned to Asami, who stood to one side, looking weary but victorious. The Avatar? She questioned, unable to bring herself to ask about Bolin specifically. We were captured in Unalaq's camp, but Bumi got us out, Asami explained. Then we went to the portal, but Korra decided it would be best for me to take her father and come back here. What are they going to do? Kita asked, struggling to hide the desperation in her voice. Bumi, Kaya, and Tenzin are going to find Jinora, while Bolin, Mako, and Korra are going to try to close the portal before it's too late. Kita turned on her heel and headed for the door. This was all she needed to hear. She almost made it before her father intercepted her. Where are you going? They're in trouble. I'm not needed here. I'm going to help, Kita said. Her voice was biting as the ice that was already creeping up her fingertips as she water-bent without thinking. Her father squared his shoulders, looking down at his only child. She wondered if she would physically have to move him to get him out of her way. At this point, she was willing to. She knew her father loved her, but when she set her mind to something, there was little that could stand in her path. Torque heaved a mighty sigh, his shoulders going slack. He reached for his belt and took a whalebone knife from its sheath. Here. Remember to use your head, not only your bending. I raised a girl with a head on her shoulders. A stubborn, willful one, but... Kita threw her arms around his shoulders in a hug tackle, then let go in almost the same motion and rushed out the door. Outside, she was completely blinded by the white of the sunshine on the snow. She staggered, tugging her coat around herself. Her eyes streamed with tears as she blinked and tried to force herself to see. She made out the shapes of Tenzin's sky bison, and beside him... Naga! Kita called to the polar bear dog. The large animal raised her head and made a sniffing sound. Kita had considered the bison, but she had never flown one before, and this would be a bad time to learn. Kita had taken dog riding lessons as a child, however, even as her father had fretted she might fall off and break something. What do you say, Naga? Should we go help your master? Naga pricked up her ears and sniffed Kita thoroughly, then huffed again, and turned to allow the young woman access to the saddle. Kita swung up into the creature's broad back, taking hold of the reins, which were really more of a formality with a polar bear dog. Let's go, Naga. Find Korra. The animal took off with far more motivation than Kita had expected, and she almost flew off. Soon, however, she got used to the loping stride of her mount. She fixed her eyes on the spirit portal, which stood like a pillar of white fire from sky to earth. It looked so near, but she knew she would have to ride through the forest to reach it. She hunched lower along the sleek animal's back as Naga put on another burst of speed. Bolin hit the ground with his shoulder, hearing a crack he was reasonably certain was not a good sound. His wind was knocked from him in a pained huff. His brother was beside him in an instant, standing protectively over him. "I don't know if we can win this fight," Bolin groaned as he took his feet again. "We don't need to win. We just need to keep Unalaq from getting back into the spirit world," Mako said, his body already tense in a fighting stance. Bolin could feel heat rolling off of his sibling as they stood, back to back before the glowing portal. The evil waterbender they were defending against was playing a crafty game, shooting deadly ice shards at the two of them, then moving to a new vantage point, not allowing himself to be spotted. Bolin heard the sound of branches being sliced. He turned instinctively, raising a stone barrier. His quick action saved his brother from being impaled. They made brief eye contact as they waited in the lull that followed for their enemy's next attempt. A long while passed. Bolin took the time to erect several points of cover for his brother and himself all around the portal. Then they crouched, muscles becoming tight with the cold and the waiting. Bolin kept peeking over the top of his rock. "Would you stop it?" Mako growled, his voice tight, testy. "He's probably waiting for you to do that again, and then he'll take your head off with a big chunk of ice." "It's been so long," Bolin almost whined. He didn't like being on edge like this. It was completely at odds with his easygoing nature. He shot a look at the firebender. Knowing Mako, he was probably enjoying this. He was so uptight. Sometimes Bolin just wanted to tell him to unclench for 10 minutes. Maybe he went home. The earthbender attempted a joke. "Hello." A face popped around the side of Bolin's rock. "My feeble turtle duck." Bolin was not proud of the sound he made as Eska's rush of water took him down. Desna moved and dealt swiftly with Mako, pushing the brothers together. Just as Bolin was trying to collect some of his very scattered thoughts and stand up, a larger blast of water smashed both of them to the side, winding Bolin so badly that everything went black. He was vaguely aware of Unalaq walking past him. "Don't let them escape this time," he heard the man say to his obedient offspring. Bolin wished he could clear his thoughts enough to shout to the twins. Already Korra had tried to convince them that what their father was doing was a mistake. Desna had seemed to weaken, but Eska... Oh, Eska. She was like the stone that the water crashed against. Her mind wouldn't be changed. Then Bolin felt someone grab the back of his coat and begin dragging him. His mind was slowly clearing, and he opened his eyes fractionally, enough to cut a glance towards his sibling. Mako's bright eyes spoke as clearly as words might have. After a lifetime of surviving on the streets with only one another for protection, the two could communicate with the smallest motions. Mako acted first, pivoting free from Desna's grip and using the motion to carry himself upright and bend fire at the same time. He turned and sent Eska recoiling with a blast of flames as Bolin scrambled free. Bolin's movements were less graceful and more efficient, the hallmark of an earthbender, as he sent their attackers leaping back with two large rocks. The brothers dove into the portal. Half a second later, they leaped out into the purplish haze of the spirit world. Mako caught sight of Korra before Bolin did, but he followed his brother's golden eyes to her prone form on the ground. They ran towards her, hearing Eska shout after them as the twins came through the portal as well. "Stop," Bolin's ex commanded. Bolin felt a sudden cold and his movements were halted mid-stride. He was unable to even wiggle a finger as the twins' ice trapped him. It barely left room for his lungs to expand, and it was so cold his body heat did not even begin to melt it. He would have shivered if he'd had the space. He hoped that Mako, as a firebender, was working on a plan to free himself. Bolin wouldn't have been worried if he hadn't seen the Avatar's limp form only moments before. He struggled to keep his eyes fixed on his friend as the dark, kite-like spirit of Vatu loomed low, then swept in towards the waiting figure of Unalaq. It was difficult to see because Eska's ice prison forced Bolin's chin up at a painful angle, but he made out arching purple lightning heading for the man. Then there was a horrible sound, part roar, part scream. Bolin didn't need to see what was happening anymore. He could see by the look on Desna's face, not mere terror, but a look of betrayal, as though he had been promised something beautiful and received this instead. Korra was on her feet again, ready for battle. "I am the new Avatar," crowed Unalaq, his body spiraling upward on a tower of water and dark spirit magic. "Well, I'm the old Avatar," Korra countered, her voice as fierce as Bolin had ever heard it. "And this era's not over yet." The two clashed together with a blast of light so bright that Bolin was momentarily blinded. He wished he was able to turn his head away. He heard Mako grunt with discomfort beside him. Bolin felt himself moving and realized that the twins were pulling them back out of the spirit world. He couldn't help but wonder if they were being protected. Certainly Desna and Eska did not want to linger in a place where two gods were essentially trying to murder one another, but they would not have had to bring the brothers with them. Whatever their reasoning, Bolin was grateful, even if he was still thoroughly trapped in the ice. Kida managed to stop the polar bear dog's headlong charge, which he judged was a safe distance from the portal. "Stay here, girl," she urged the creature, gesturing with her hands in hopes that it would make her desire even clearer. To her relief, Naga lay down and put her head on her paws, though she did shoot Kida a very baleful look. "I won't be long, I promise. I just think this part needs a stealthier touch," she said, stepping quietly away and wondering why she was bothering to explain herself to a dog. She kept low, creeping through the trees. It was so rare to see trees. She paused for a moment with her hand resting on a trunk. She found that, as with humans, she was able to sense the life force of the tree. She could also detect spirit magic flowing in the tree's life. They were so entwined that Kida knew she would not be able to get them apart, even if she concentrated her hardest. The spirit magic must keep the trees alive, she realized as she pressed on. Ahead of her at the portal, she could make out voices. She recognized the first to speak as Mako, Bolin's older brother. "Please, let us go," he said. Desna's voice came next. He sounded amused. "His groveling is pathetic." Eska's voice followed. "But I do enjoy the sweet scent of desperation." Kida crept closer until she was able to see them. The brothers were trapped in large blocks of ice, but otherwise seemed unharmed. Desna and Eska stood before them, their passive eyes fixed on their prisoners. Good, Kida thought. They had no idea she was there. "Come on," Mako tried again. "Your dad has become an evil monster." Kida flinched. It was too late to stop Unalaq from melding with a creature she later learned was called Vatu. She had hoped that the Avatar would be able to stop him before it got this far, but from the look of the two boys, the task had not been an easy one. She wondered what had become of Tenzin and his siblings. "He's trying to bring on eternal darkness," Mako pressed on. "Why would you protect someone who doesn't care about you at all?" Kida could make out the faces of the twins now as she slowly circled, looking for the best place to launch her attack. Eska's expression was stony as ever, but Desna's brows came together for a moment. "Father was going to let me expire when we tried to open the northern portal," the prince pointed out. "Perhaps we should rethink our position." "Yes!" Mako encouraged. "No," Eska snapped. "Don't listen to him. His words are poisoning your mind." Desna seemed to heed her words, and his face became impassive and blank again. Kida scowled. How could these two continue to be blinded by their father's evil? She decided she was in as good of a position as she was going to be. She only hoped that the twins were sufficiently distracted by Mako's efforts to reason with them. She raised her hands to shoulder height, palms downward, focusing on the blocks of ice in which Mako and Bolin were trapped. She dropped her hands with a sharp motion, and the ice turned to water and fell away from the brothers. Bolin and Mako reacted quickly. Mako was the first to move, as the earthbender seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. Kida charged in to join them, as Desna sent ice shards flying towards Bolin. He jerked his arm expertly, and a rock emerged from the ground to protect him. He crouched behind it for a moment, and Kida slid in beside him. His eyes were huge when he saw her. His mouth hung open as though he intended to speak, but his words had left him faster than Mako's fire blasts escaped their caster's hands. "Little help?" Mako shouted. "Sorry," Bolin called back, launching several small rocks at Desna's head, forcing the young man to duck instead of sending a rush of frigid water into Mako's back. "Look who's here! It's Kita!" "Who?" Mako turned to look, and recognition dawned in his eyes. Kita had to act quickly, redirecting the gush of water sent by Eska. The Water Tribe princess roared with rage when she saw Kita. You boyfriend-stealing hussy!" "Hussy?" Bolin asked as he dodged behind one of the rock barriers, then stamped his foot to cause Desna to trip several feet away. Kita shrugged, an impish smile on her face. She had a difficult time keeping up with the frenzied tempo of the battle. Mako and Bolin seemed so at home, blocking, dodging, and dealing out attacks. Kita could only seem to concentrate on one thing at a time. As a result, both boys had come to her aid more than once, and she was starting to wonder if she was more of a hindrance than a help. She was best at grabbing the twins' attacks out of the air and redirecting them harmlessly into the trees. Suddenly she felt a rush of cold ice enclose her body. She had time to squeak before her mouth was covered. The ice pressed in hard around her. "Stop!" Eska's voice echoed harshly. The brothers halted their attacks and took in the scene. Mako readied his fire, but seemed unsure. Could he melt Kita free without burning her? She wasn't sure, and clearly neither was he. Eska squeezed more tightly until Kita's ribs screamed in protest. "No!" Bolin's voice had a ragged edge to it. Kita wondered if it was from exhaustion or from something else. "Let her go, Eska." "It's too late, my little turtle duck." The princess glowered at the earthbender. "You have damaged my heart. You left me at the altar." Kita's eyebrows went up. This was new information. She cut a look towards Bolin, which was all she could do, as ensconced in ice as she was. "Perhaps," the woman's tone softened slightly, "you were afraid of your true feelings for me." She was giving him an out. Bolin's fists tightened. "No, Eska. You and I are too different. I'm sure there's a guy out there for you. One who likes being told what to do and where to go. But that's not me, Eska. I'm sorry." For a moment, Kita thought the ice around her was going to loosen. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Mako trying to get a better angle to attack one of the twins. She wished she could shake her head because Desna was watching intently. Then the water-bending prince's eyes fell on Kita, and recognition dawned in them. He knew her. He remembered how she had healed him that day, after his father had left him for dead. She held his gaze, trying to communicate with only her eyes. Then Eska tightened the ice. If Kita had been able to yell out, she would have. A tear broke free and ran down her cheek. "No!" Bolin shouted, and rocks erupted from under the snow. But before he could send them toward the twins, Kita felt the ice around her fall away in a rush of water. "Enough!" Desna's voice was clear and full of authority. He strode towards his sister, arms raised to waterbend. He shot a sideways glance towards Kita as he moved to stand between her and Eska, who now only looked baffled. "I have had enough, sister. Again and again I am assured that our father is right, that he is doing the best thing for us, but I never see it. How many times am I going to look at the man who is supposed to love me and realize he doesn't before I figure it out? How many times will you? He left me for dead." The young man's tone was filled with venom. "This girl healed me. I could look into her eyes and see more caring than I do in our father's. I have had enough." Eska blinked. Clearly this was more words than she had heard her brother string together in a long time. She struggled to keep her face its usual uncaring mask. Kita could see it, though, as she slumped to the ground, already using her ability to assess the damage to herself. A little frostbite and a bruised rib, nothing she could not easily repair. She watched the twins as Desna walked over to meet his sister and look evenly in her eyes. Finally, she dipped her head in the slightest of nods. "I understand, brother. This is larger than our petty troubles. She turned to glare at Bolin, which might have turned him into an ice cube if it was possible to waterbend with your eyes. I would have liked to have spent eternal darkness with you, but I suppose it was not to be. I suppose so. Bolin looked baffled but relieved. Go, Desna said, turning to look at Kida with a strange sadness. We will remain here. Thank you, Desna, Kida said. She got to her feet and walked over to the young man. He almost flinched when she touched him, but stopped himself. She pressed her hand gently against his chest, closing her eyes. In moments she had healed the full, pulled, and weary muscles he had sustained in the battle with Bolin and Mako. He stepped back, his face bright and clearer than she had seen it. He dipped his head in a grateful bow, though his eyes still looked a little lost and sorrowful. Bolin seemed to break out of a trance as he finally hurried over to Kida. Are you all right? He gasped, looking her over. His cheeks shone red. Was it from the cold or something else? I'm fine. I already healed the few injuries Eska gave me. Good. Bolin acted quickly before he could think better of it. He grabbed her wrist, pulled her to him, and kissed her full on the lips. What the kiss lacked in finesse, it made up for in earnestness. It was the most honest, take-me-as-I-am kiss that Kida had ever received. She liked it very much, and was sad when it was over. For a moment she was trapped in the pull of Bolin's emerald eyes, which were locked on hers as though he never intended to look away. Then their spell was broken by Mako's hand on his brother's shoulder. Come on, lover boy. Kida, Bolin, and Mako charged into the portal together. Kida was not prepared for the view on the other side. The Avatar, locked in combat with Unalaq, the two of them towering above the battlefield on columns of water. The boys tried to charge past her, but she stopped them, pressing a hand to each of their chests to halt their progress. Wait, she urged them. If you're going to be any use in battle, you need to be fresh. She focused her mind and closed her eyes. She had never healed two people at the same time before, even if their injuries were minor. Tracking the heartbeats of the two was a new rush she had never felt. She liked it, but it made it difficult to focus on her task. Carefully, she loosened muscles and eased aches. This must be what playing a musical instrument was like, she mused as she worked. She heard Mako let out a sound of surprise and relief as she pulled free a particularly tough knot in his lower back. That has been getting worse for a while now, the young man admitted. Bolin, keep this girl. I think I will. Kida couldn't help it. She opened her eyes and looked fondly at the earthbender, even as a cut on his lip closed flawlessly. I think you're ready. The young healer stepped back. She knew her fighting skills were abysmal at best, but if she could keep the two boys in fighting shape, she hoped she could be of some use. She tilted her head as the three began to run. The Avatar was still battling away, but it didn't look like she was winning. Kida couldn't believe what she saw next. Unalaq had Korra on the ground. A dark spirit energy seemed to be pouring from his face. Then that darkness spread to the Avatar's head and pulled the light from her eyes as though it was a separate being. Kida realized that it was. Her heart gave a lurch. Batu, the spirit of evil, was ripping the spirit of light from within the Avatar. Kida wished she could run faster, but she was not certain what she would do if she got there in time. Korra! Mako shouted, putting on a burst of speed. He's got the light spirit, Bolin spoke next, already leaping into the air to come down bending. The brothers did not need to be near the combat to fight, Kida realized, as she called the snow around her to become water whips along her arms. She had a plan now, too. Her goal was to reach the Avatar where the girl lay on the ground. If she could heal her in some way, perhaps that would help. Some plan was better than no plan at all, she reasoned, darting past a blast of fire from Mako. She dodged expertly, not worried that the boys would hurt her accidentally. They were too skilled, she'd seen that. Their attacks seemed to rock Unalaq for a moment, and Kida doubled her speed, gasping in lungfuls of frigid air. But Unalaq rallied, and before Kida knew what hit her, she and the boys were thrown backwards by an avalanche of deadly ice. Kida managed to protect herself for the most part with water bending, but she was still almost completely buried in snow and ice shards. She tried to see the boys, but the snow swirled around her too much, and she had to struggle her arms free to bend it away. She could make out Mako's red scarf against the white, and realized she had to make a choice. Make another dash for Korra, or go help Bolin and Mako. She glanced sideways at Unalaq. She knew she didn't stand a chance against him. Korra was too near him, laid out at his feet. He was attacking Rava again and again. Kita felt a tug at her heart, almost as though someone had reached inside with bending and called to her. Rava was dying, and Kita, the healer, was watching. She wavered, uncertain. Could she charge into death in hopes of rescuing the light spirit? She knew she would only be a minor inconvenience to Unalaq and Vatu, a gnat to be swatted aside. Slowly, so as not to draw attention to herself, Kita made her way towards Mako. Snow sprayed the young man as Kita slid to her knees at his side. Blood spilled from a wound on his forehead. She pressed her fingers to his brow, trying her best to focus. She could feel the small tremors in the ground as the light spirit was beaten. Her concentration slipped, and she almost made the wound worse, but she managed to get herself under control. Mako's golden eyes snapped open, and he sat up swiftly. She didn't have time to check him for other injuries. He was on his feet, heading for Korra. Kita looked around swiftly. Bolin was half buried in the snow. She would have missed him if not for his dark hair. As she landed on her knees at the earthbender's side, she glanced over her shoulder towards the one-sided battle. Mako was supporting Korra, who hung limp against him, not even raising her head. Concern flooded through Kita, but she turned back to the task at hand. Triage. She didn't know the extent of Bolin's injuries. He was worse off than his sibling, a bruised rib and a sprained wrist. He'd also taken a blow to the head, though it was merely a bump. She focused on waking him up. His eyes fluttered open, taking her in for a moment before looking over her shoulder and going very wide. Kita followed Bolin's gaze and saw with horror that Rava had gone completely. Unalaq no longer looked like himself. Purple spirit energy surged from him, so strong that Kita could feel it push her hair back and sting her eyes. She flinched, but was unable to tear herself away from the scene that was unfolding. Vatu seemed to have fully fused with the man now. He grew, twisted and inhuman, into a monstrous spirit creature. Kita gasped. The giant spoke with a voice that Kita felt in her spine. "Now 10,000 years of darkness begins." The creature reached up into the sky, its claws seeming to tear into the fabric of the spirit world before it became lightning and vanished. Kita had the presence of mind to throw herself over Bolin to shield him as the shock wave from the giant's exit smashed into the group. And then there was nothing but cold and silence.